G'day. Welcome to the AgriCoach Podcast. For families on the land who want to grow their family's wealth and prosperity across the generations. I'm your host, Ben Law, and I'm the financial bloke. G'day. Welcome back to the AgriCoach Wealth and Wisdom Podcast, the show for families who want more than just financial success. They want to grow and protect their wealth, strengthen relationships, and maintain their success across the generations. My name's Ben Law. I'm the financial bloke, back with a special live episode recorded on ground at the 3R Beef pre-bull sale dinner, held at the historic Gunnaganoo Station in Tamworth, New South Wales. Today you're going to hear from someone who proves that you don't need a golden ticket to succeed in ag. Garry Edwards grew up passionate about agriculture, but like many young people, he didn't have a succession plan laid out for him. No pathway, no handover. But instead of sitting around sulking about it, he backed himself. He dug in, took risks, he worked his ass off, and today he's the managing director and founder of AAM Investment Group, managing over $1 billion in agricultural assets across beef, poultry, water, cropping, and timber. What's even more impressive, he's one of the most humble blokes you'll ever come across. He's operating at a level most of us will never see, but he still speaks the same language as the rest of us. We dig into how he got started, why he invests across multiple commodities when most stick to just one, and how AAM is navigating everything from global trade shocks to supply chain resilience, all while staying firmly rooted in Australian agriculture. So if you're serious about the business of ag and you want a front row seat to where the smart money's going, how the big decisions are being made, and what the future looks like at scale, this is an episode for you. And also, if you're a young person in ag without a clear succession plan laid out, you need to hear this. There's more than one way to build a future in this industry. I know that from personal experience. Now, a quick heads up. Because this was recorded in front of a live crowd, the audio quality won't be quite as polished as my usual studio setup. But don't make the mistake of tuning out, because this episode is an absolute cracker. Buckle up. This is one you won't want to miss. We're sitting down with someone here tonight who's the chair of Cattle Australia, and that's probably where you know him from mostly. But some of you probably won't know is he's quietly built one of Australia's most significant agricultural businesses in the country. Gary's name's Garry Edwards. We worked out the other day that we met each other when we were young fellas running around down at the Sydney show. So we just stopped the conversation there and said we wouldn't talk about any of the mischief we were up to. But he's also the founder and managing director of AAM Investment Group. Now, Gary's got about 25 years experience. I think that's probably stretching it. There's a bit more than that, isn't there, Garry? I know I've probably developing and managing large-scale agricultural operations here in Australia. He established AAM back in 2007 and since then has grown it into an ag asset with approximately $1 billion in agricultural assets. And that includes beef, lamb, cropping, poultry, and also sustainably sourced timber, which is a real mix. Now, Gary's philosophy or guiding philosophy for the business is to improve the assets within the AAM store to ensure the land and infrastructure remain sustainable and better than what they found them. So tonight we're going to unpack Gary's journey. He's been kind enough to let us do that. From the paddock, because he all started in the paddock like we did, to the boardroom and explore what sets the AAM model apart from everyone else. And also to have a bit of a go at tackling some of the big challenges and opportunities for Australian ag right now, right through from trade shocks to the opportunities that there are as the world improves and gets richer with protein production. Now, for some of you, you might sort of think, well, what's this Garry story? Now he's more in the boardroom than anything. What's Gary's story really going to mean to me as a rural producer on the ground? And what I came up with, and I think this is really important, is the principles behind Gary's and AAM's success and his outlook on where the Australian ag industry and internationally is going to go apply to you whether you're a large operator, whether you're in ag, serving the ag industry or operating in the ag industry. So whether it's spotting opportunities, whether it's managing risk differently or understanding global trends, there's going to be an insight in here for all of you. Now, if you're invested where the ag industry is headed and you want to position yourself to thrive, you're in the right place. So I'd like you to put your hands together before we kick off for Garry Edwards. So I'm going to hog the microphone. I'm not going to give it yet because I might struggle to get it back. Hey, Garry. He's done more than enough of these. So before we kick in, and I think we're going to get into the big picture strategy of you and AAM, but I want to wind it back a little bit and go back to your origin story, because I think everyone will want to hear that. So where did you start off, and leading up to, say, when AAM kicked off, mate?
Well, I was firstly, thank you for the invite from Jeff and Tony and the 3R team, and thank you, Ben, for this. I hope that this is going to be an enjoyable experience. It's always interesting. People often ask me, where did you start and what it is, and I guess the greatest thing is I grew up a couple of hours southeast of here at a little place called Stroud, which actually happens to be the original home of the land grant for AA Company, which is their 200-year anniversary next year. I went to school in Gloucester, and I was very fortunate to have a number of people that I've seen here again tonight that I met back in those early days, running around, judging cattle, showing cattle, learning how to do all those fun things, spending a lot of time at royal shows, and thank God we didn't have social media back then, as I like to say. But, the people and the opportunity and starting with that at a really commercial farming basis. My parents had a commercial cattle business that was quite small at the time. My grandfather had Hereford cattle on a property that we recently were very fortunate to buy back with my sister. And, my father was a hardwood timber miller, cutting railway sleepers. And literally off the original property that he grew up on is where his very first timber mill was. And I guess when you're young and you go through these processes, and I remember being at my 18th birthday, and at 18 you think you know everything, but in actual fact you know nothing. And on my 18th birthday, I remember saying all of these things that I'd never ever do. And the first thing was I'd never live in a city, I'd never work in an office, I'd never go to university, and I sure as shit would have nothing to do with the timber industry again. Now, I've managed to screw all of those up, and that just shows how little you know when you're 18, because I thought I'd find a job managing a place. That was going to be my life. My first job after I was fortunate to win a scholarship to go to the University of Illinois in America through the Angus Society, was back looking after a Charolais place down at Canowindra. It's a place called Pinaroo Charolais. And there's people here tonight I met through that experience, David and David in that process. And it was interesting because that experience, and I guess for those of you who went to Pinaroo in that era, it showed the potential of what money can do in an investment and what was done, but it also showed what a complete lack of cattle sense would do in wasting money. Because it was an extraordinary facility, terrible place to work at because you wanted to do everything when the owner wasn't in the stockyards. So I'd manufacture any reason I possibly could to have him off going and doing a different job while I went and worked in the yards and with the cattle. And going through that process, I worked out that I needed to do something a little bit more proactive with my life than just sit there and fix fences and muster cattle all day, as enjoyable as that was. And there's plenty of days now sitting in the boardroom I'd like to go back and do that. But that really started on the journey, and I was very fortunate to get heavily involved in what you would know today as the NLIS, developing a lot of that technology and we actually ended up buying and then buying a computer business, knowing nothing about computers, and actually building a lot of the systems and integration that is today how the NLIS works in regards to capturing data at a property or a feedlot or a sale yard and abattoir and how that information, and that really taught me the power of data management and what you could do with that, and certainly exposed issues and opportunities around properties and profitability. And I was very fortunate to then get a job as a consultant or a contractor for this small business that was owned by a guy called Kerry Packer. And that was a really interesting time to really be challenged to go and apply the use of this stuff in very large herds and work out how we could improve the productivity of these very big pastoral properties in the Northern Territory, and the integration of breeding programs and what have you. And really at the end of all of that, through an unintended consequence, you learn a lot, and then the opportunity come up to get involved in investment. And the first thing actually was in sale yards, and similar to the one that we did here in Tamworth in building the new facility here with Palisade as the financier out of Sydney. But the very first one, and why it was 2007, is that the first one we did was the Carcore facility down near Blaney in New South Wales. And that was really our first effort in understanding how to get investors to invest in something agricultural. And from there, that sowed the seed that ultimately becomes AAM from that story on.
Excellent. Well, I think I said the same things as you, Gary. I think it was, I'm never going to university. I'm never going to finish school, never going to finish university, never going to live in the city, never going to have an office job. And I've done all of those as well. So I think that's sage advice for anyone who's 18. Okay, so we've just sort of got up to the beginning of AAM and how it kicked off. So that's the spark, would you say, that sort of started that AAM? Talk us through what the early days look like, because it's easy to get a little bit of money to start with, but it's very hard to keep the ball rolling. Talk us through the early days, Gary.
Well, the early days, to be frank, we just had no idea what we were doing. We had a good idea and we had an understanding of how to sort of make things operate. But what we really didn't understand is how to make things investable, from an investor's perspective. And I guess, fundamentally and ultimately what we've tried to focus on at that point in time was there was limited investment from Australian businesses and Australian investors in agriculture. And that was a challenge that I wanted to crack. I really thought we needed more investment of Australians in Australia. And I really thought that was a unique situation of how we dealt with family businesses and that opportunity around it. So going through that process that we did back then and starting off and tackling the issues, if you want a career in education and maturity, go and work in a sale yard at a council with some agents and they'll knock you into shape pretty fast. There's some pretty good learning experiences there with some incredible operators, but looking at how they then run their businesses and how they looked at marketing and what we saw about how doing an investment led them to change some of their business opportunities really made us stop and think about the broader opportunity that was beyond that infrastructure initially, and really how we focused on investing in essentially what were originally family businesses to create a big family business. Because the fundamental backstory of AAM and, AAM today is owned by its management. My wife and I are obviously the major shareholders, but it's owned entirely by its management team. That is the management company. And the vast majority of those people all started in family businesses somewhere. And we've collected them as they've turned up in the cities and looking for opportunities and relationships you build over time. But a number of our people have worked for us for 15, 17 and approaching 20 years in a very near future. So they were all people that come from areas where their family operation wasn't big enough to maintain them. They wanted a career in agriculture. We became a pathway to attract people. And ultimately, the success of all of this is having great people. You can do whatever you like with the money, but the money is only as good as the people investing it and doing the work. And ultimately, where we started was learning all of the things that we didn't understand about the financial world and how to go about how we pitched that and how we looked at investing that and creating investments. And I guess the first major investment that we did in what is the current cycle post being involved in the sale yards was actually in the chicken industry. And you ask why? Well, what we worked out is we could make investing in the chicken industry for an investor be the same as investing in property. So it had a contracted basis that we could enter into that had an offtake, it had a relatively known outcome, and therefore we could get people that had no interest or no understanding of agriculture through the fear of investing by manufacturing an investment product that simply paid them a quarterly annuity. That's the brain spark. There's no more science to it than that. And then getting them comfort on that process to show that you could do it meant that they were then more comfortable to look at other opportunities in a broader spectrum, but we had to build a track record to do it. And, I don't care what anyone says. When we started out, we knew nothing in the sense of how to do the financial side of it. In 2007, we learned a lot by the time we got to 2017-18 and started the investment cycle that we're now doing that you're referring to, which is the version of AAM that is out there today.
Because I can't think of anything more true it's the people that make the business, not necessarily the strategy. And I love the way you've said you've collected the right people into the business. And I'm guessing, I know in my business, one of the first things that I actually check on a family that I'm going to coach and advise on is character, and trying to find that right character. So you sort of touched on it there, but I'd really like to understand, because managing other people's money, I spent 22 years as a financial advisor, and that's a high trust thing. What's allowed your investors, do you think, to actually trust you with their money versus someone else? I mean, obviously you've touched on the property side of things and having a simple strategy, but why are they trusting you with what we're talking about here, $1 billion, Garry?
Yeah, well, it doesn't seem like that when you say it fast.
Yeah.
But, the ultimate discipline is treating it as though it's your own money. And I guess walking into all of these boardrooms and what have you, and being the person that was grounded to answer the questions. We have many, many contemporaries that do this, but most of them turn up in suits trying to sell agricultural investments. I probably turn up roughly like I do today, or if it's not at a site, I'm not wearing a jacket. And therefore, it becomes relatable to people when you can answer questions with depth and detail around what it is that they're talking about and actually physically explain it to them rather than talking about concepts from 5,000 feet. So when they talk about, what's the breeding cycle of a cow and what do you do and when do you sell it and what you do, and you can explain that in 30 or 40 seconds and go, well, that's the answer. People resonate with people that give them decisive outcomes, not situations of talking about, well, we could do this conceptually and we can do that conceptually. The fact was getting it out of the spreadsheets and getting it into their hearts and minds, because a lot of what we do in agriculture, like everybody in this room, there's an emotional engagement that creates the passion of why you do what you do. You don't do this purely because of the financial outcome. There's a bigger mental buy-in that's involved in this process. And there is for all of those investors. They wanted to invest in something that was tangible. They wanted to invest in something that was real and it wasn't a spreadsheet. It wasn't a hypothetical outcome. So getting to spend time with people and really being able to explain that scenario. When we first started going, you do these capital raising situations, you'd normally have to go and meet people a couple of times to get them to know you, and then you'd actually have a discussion about investing. The interesting thing in those forums, and I encourage everyone and every young person that comes into our business, my answer, they ask about, how do you go and sell something? I said, I don't. I go and ask questions. And when you go and ask enough questions, you find out what's important to people. And where you find something that's important, that's relatable, doesn't matter what it's about, you can actually have an engaged rapport, and then eventually you can talk about what it is that you want to do commercially. Because if you go in there and you're simply approaching these processes like a used car salesperson and asking them for the money, you'll get, thank you very much, see you later. There's a factory of people that do that. The unique thing that we've tried to demonstrate to our investors and our staff is that connection. And that is really what drives their passion and what they do. And I guess why we've focused we're a really large business these days that is probably one of the largest businesses with family principles that still run it. And that's something that I'm going to hang on to as long as I'm in charge of AEM. Other people can have a crack and go in a different direction that they like, because it's the integrity of that and understanding where you come from. And frankly, when you remember that you come from nothing and you've had to earn everything you've done and you respect other people's money that way, well, they tend to follow it. And I love these situations rather than talking in rooms full of investors, because every one of you people here has an authentic story about why you do what you do, why you're here tonight, why it is that you're connected to livestock or regional location. That's the authenticity of this stuff, and that's something that you can't fabricate in a spreadsheet.
And people sniff that out pretty quickly, the authenticity, don't they? Okay, so Garry, one of the things that I noticed when I looked at AAM was the cross-commodity model that you've got. We talked about lamb, chicken, beef, timber, etc. Most producers and even investment companies stick with like a one commodity. They're a beef business, they're a chicken business, etc. What's your thinking behind going cross-commodity rather than just sticking in your lane and doing that well?
Well, I guess the first answer is that we couldn't agree on what lane to stick in. It was the first issue. Because when we went and did the first project with the chickens, and then we did the second project, which was a livestock cattle project, investors asked us, what are you guys doing with a cattle project? Aren't you the chicken experts? And we had to explain to them, look, when we did the chickens, we really didn't know much about them, but they've worked really well. We actually hopefully know a little bit more about cattle and these other opportunities. So that's really how that evolved through that process. But the principle was, I was surprised at the number of investors that we're getting that were actually producers in some way. And we had a number of people come and invest with us as an alternate income stream to their farming enterprise. And the cattle guys all wanted to invest in the chickens, and people in other areas want to invest in the cattle because there was alternate exposures to what they had. And it was really around the correlation of trying to get away from single commodity cycles. You know, the boom bust routine of beef prices being up and then through the floor, and having all of your investment in one situation meant that your volatility in your balance sheet and your P&L went up and down like a yo-yo depending on what was going on, versus having different investments that produced income at different times of the year allowed us to create more stability in theory. But it also created more capital security. And it meant that we had leveraged opportunities in that what we're able to value add is that the byproducts, for instance, of our chicken facilities in South Australia. So for those of you who don't know, we grow a handful of chickens, about 25 million a year for Inghams in South Australia. We're actually the largest grower for Inghams in the country. But no one will ever know that because everyone talks about cattle and the sheep and the other processes. But the byproduct and the waste flooring and I guess the litter that comes out of that process, we saw an opportunity to take it from an expense to an income by adding some carbon to it, which is the byproduct of trees, and converting it to a compost that today we have one of the biggest integrated vermiculture fertiliser businesses attached to it, that we take that fertiliser and we put it into our other operations as an organic fertiliser, or we sell it off to other people. So what was a waste in one area, when put together, became an income. And I never thought I'd ever be in the business of breeding and monitoring the DNA of worms, but we've actually bred a worm over multiple generations that will now eat a pure pile of chicken litter. Now, I can't tell you the EBVs of that and what the performance is because they're pretty terminal. They either survive or they don't survive. But at the end of the day, the performance of these things and what you can do by applying the same genetic principles that we do in our livestock operations actually work with the worms. So these high-performing worms will chew through this pile of waste and produce this highly valued castings product that when we sold it to the winery industry, they were getting their first season of grapes out of new plantings a whole year earlier. And that was the impact of the fertiliser and the component and working through that. So this is where unintentionally having these things as a different integrations and the stability that we're looking to try and create and the capital protection that we're trying to create, that I must say worked to a point. It hasn't worked in one area though, and that is that really to do that, we needed to get to the point of our full integrated supply chains a couple of years earlier. So the challenge is that, and you will know this as a producer, when you're relying solely on the farm gate price, that moves up and down. The end of the supply chain moves very little. So whilst we can see 50% or 100% volatility, depending on what you're looking at on the price of cattle or lamb, what happens at the end where it's actually wholesaled moves very little. So our strategy and all along was to get to that point. Unfortunately, the beef cattle price fell off a cliff before we got there. So we had to ride that process out. But today we have our own export business, marketing beef and lamb directly to the United States, to Korea, to the Middle East and Asia. And the intention that we do there is to invite other producers to participate, because we don't intend to want to own all of that land. We've done the work of create it. We now want to actually make it take on bigger contracts, but we'll need other producers to help with that. But it's that integration that creates the true stability, because it takes all the peaks and trough off the price, because we price things 6 months in advance and we now have an offtake to deliver against. And what our aim was how to create the same type of contracted stability to know roughly what our income was going to be in the next year and the year after by building those relationships and having those contractual businesses, rather than simply worrying what the weaner price is this week or the store cattle price or what the Ecky's done. Because if I never hear the word Ecky again, I'll be a very happy person. And that was the foundation of the diversity of the commodities, but being deep in their supply chains. And I guess it was similar to what we developed off the contract with Inghams, where we have a situation that they contracted out. They were giving us 10-year contracts, so we knew what it was. We could invest in it. It was very stable. So we've simply tried to replicate that. And that's in a similar way how we have our own feedlot operations in Indonesia these days. And I'm somewhat surprised that there's not more companies that do it, but it is bloody hard to get through that cross-country cultural stuff of starting a business in another country where English is not their predominant language. Now, when you do, it's okay. While you're going through that cycle, it's tough. Once you get out the other side and you get established, then there's lots of benefits because we now have known markets that we can place products. So we now breed cattle to a known market outcome that we're in control of. So when you go and buy genetics and you're all here for a bull sale tomorrow, we're looking at how that's going to produce progeny to be offtake and what market it's hitting, and making sure that we've got the market to take it, and whether it's a high valued or a low valued situation. So that's really, people focus on the breadth of commodities, but it's not just that. It's the two-way or two-dimensional or three-dimensional, if you like, pathway of how to go deep in those supply chains to do it.
And again, Garry, people are involved there, isn't it? I keep hearing that same thing coming through. You're looking for people to team up with or have joint ventures, dealing with finding people over in Indonesia, etc. That's a deep philosophy of the family business, isn't it? So one of the things that we're seeing a lot of, and it's been very topical over the last 9 months at least, is trade shocks and geopolitical change. We see that every week. We've seen what's happening with the US, with the tariffs around the world. We're always seeing these black swan events. So how do you guys think about those risks within the business when it comes to geopolitical and trade issues, especially as you're starting to expand overseas?
Well, it's all about having greater control. And there's really two numbers that I like around control, and that's 0 or 100%. You can often do it if you've got a majority, but when it's completely your problem to solve or it's not your problem entirely, they're very defined outcomes. As far as the geopolitical situation is concerned, we're focused on how we create stability. So we go into those markets and into those countries, and we're looking at having a diversity there so that how you can price things and have some ability around a product mix that you're not totally in one market. We saw the problem the Australian cattle industry had in 2020 when this crazy thing called COVID turned up and the world went mad and China didn't like us anymore. And China was our largest purchaser of beef and lamb. We got an education of why every industry should have diversity of markets and relationships, not be all in on one market. Because when China decided that they didn't like us and they liked the US better, for whatever reason, it was obviously, from my perspective, they felt that obviously they could push one market around more than the other in a leverage situation. So we lost out dramatically. And I think we all know what happened ultimately through the shock of that, and when the beef price really tailed off in the end of 2022 in that process, because you had a market that grew to be our dominant or at least second dominant market that we export to. In truth, our third dominant market, because in the cattle industry and the sheep industry, our number one market's our domestic market, which we forget about. But by volume, our domestic market's always the biggest. And then we went all in on China. China was wanting everything, consuming it. We didn't have those relationships. So as a business, what we're always trying to do is make sure that we're deep in a range of markets, if you like, not just one, unless you have a very clear situation that you've got a contract that can't just be cut off just because one party doesn't like it. And this is the nature of contracts. They've got to be win-win. Contracts that are win-lose or lose-win, they're terrible because one side's always happy and the other side's always hating it. So the balance is to try and create these situations that is a win-win commitment. And I guess that's why we've taken the approach of not trying to chase the peak price and actually backing that off, because we need the other end of the supply chain to be profitable. It's never good when they're losing money and we're making all the money because they want to end that relationship. If we make sure that everyone keeps making some money, the robustness in those relationships is much stronger. And the challenge as a producer out there, and I grew up with this, is when you've got one operation around a key land asset and you're producing whatever quantity you produce, a lot of what you do is turns off at a single point in time. And I guess what we are trying to do as a business is to integrate that further and not have that farm gate trade shock, but actually have something that gives us an option to retain that ownership and be involved in that further. And I guess the most extreme event of that is that in what we're doing now with Chipotle through the ABL code, which is the Australian Beef and Lamb Company we set up, They're opening 400 more stores this year. Now, that's an extreme amount of containers to fuel that expansion, let alone the volume that they take at the moment. But having diversity of those, and I guess when we first started looking at this, we had a contract that was put to us to a supermarket that wanted to buy 1,000 lambs a week. They just wanted to buy them every week, and they all wanted them to look the same. So the challenge was, how do you build enough scale and robustness, and what do we do with our partners around that, not just what we do ourselves, to actually seize that opportunity? So it is about that broader depth of thought process, and in many cases not trying to do everything ourselves, but having the right partners that go into that journey and them having aligned outcomes that they make profits along the way. There's no point being in the room with a pile of money and your key relationships having none. It's got to be a balanced situation.
Yeah, that's a big lesson, I think, for everyone. And in the corporate world, that's not always the case. It's usually very much a try to get a win-lose. That's actually a win short-term for them, isn't it? So, okay, so obviously from your background, you're obviously passionate about agriculture, but you're also bullish in your investments. And with the uncertainty going on, prices going up, there's a lot of uncertainty. Why are you still so bullish on agriculture, and why are your investors bullish on the industry?
Well, ultimately, if you look around the world, Australian land prices are very low compared to other developed nations, which is why there's a lot of capital flowing here from overseas, particularly Europe and particularly North America. But at the same time, we export roughly 70% of what we produce. And we are in a cycle that with this dirty great island, which is why our biosecurity works well for us, where we participate in global markets where people want to buy our product. So there's a pull-through nature of it. So if you think about this for a second, and I know we're obviously here about the cattle sale today, but the population, and I hope I get these numbers right, the population of sheep that we have in this country as far as global numbers is somewhere around 3 to 5%. But we are 36% of the global sheep exports. If you do a similar calculation in cattle, we're a very small percent of the actual herd volume, but we're a big percentage because we're a small population of that global market. And I guess we're bullish fundamentally on food. We're bullish on the fact that people want to eat protein. Developing nations want to eat protein. So we're very heavily invested in that. And at the same time, we see lots of opportunity, like what's going on with the timber, is that it's insane that in this country we would need to import timber. We can grow a tree or two. So it doesn't make sense to me that where you see these collisions in supply chains to say, well, there's lots of imports, that means we're probably not doing a good enough job in what we're doing, growing, producing, and how we integrate that. But in the context of the bullish part about agriculture, it's bullish around food. And if you look at those big populations around the world, how many times, and I'll get shot for saying this, but I'm going to say it anyway, how many times you see pictures of families of an Asian demographic where the next generation is towering over the parents? That's called protein. That's the same genetic expression, which you would all understand here, just expressed with getting protein in a human's diet earlier, nothing else. Originally, that starts off as milk protein. Then it moves into cereal proteins, and it moves ultimately into animal meat proteins, and it starts with white meats and it fits the pinnacle of red meat. And if you go to those places and watch how they value food, we take for granted the wonderful food we're going to have here tonight. For them, it's an experience and it's a privilege. And what they're investing in is their future generations to make them stronger and healthier. So when you see all these tall Asian people now, that's their genetic expression being allowed to happen through nutrition. It'd be the same thing if we starved our weaners and expected them to grow to be mature cows. It's no different. But we have this enormous population in the world that can't produce their own food. And we have an inhabited country with a massive landmass that's frankly underinvested, massively underinvested. We're an inhabited landmass. We're not an invested landmass. But there's a lot of productivity you can drive from Australia through the utilisation of our natural resources, water, etc., to improve that basic productivity. So we're very bullish on the opportunity of what the future development is, not what the development's been, but what it's going to be, and how we can apply data to make better decisions, and then how we can better present a food product to the market that wants to consume that product at the highest quality we can. And that means different things to different people. That's not everything marble, just so we're clear. That's relative to what they want to eat and how they want to eat it. And whether you're looking at the cattle that we're sending to Indonesia or what we're sending through the feedlot operations, we're very bullish on the fact that into the future, food inflation is going to be very positive to agriculture. So back to those low land prices fundamentally from a global perspective, back from the fact you can invest if you've got scale to deal with these things. You don't necessarily need to be a corporate company anyway. It's just how you integrate that and become part of a scale-based outcome, and what that means ultimately as far as you delivering into that market. That's really the fundamentals.
Love that. It's an exciting future, isn't it? And especially with technology coming along now. I mean, you talk about data. We're going to be seeing a lot more data coming through over the next 10 to 15 years. So, Garry, you've sat in the seats that everyone here in the room's sat in before. You and I grew up in this area. If you were sitting back in that seat, what do you think every producer should be focusing on over the next 10 to 15 years to make sure that they're set up to thrive, not only over the next 10 to 15 years, but across the generations?
Well, you do have to think about what you're producing and what you're breeding and really what market is genuinely going to. And I'll say this, in a number of circumstances where we've been involved in buying assets, and we bought 35 assets over the last 5 or 6 years, all too often in those experiences when I'm sitting with people that are aged between 70 and 90, they're sitting there and they're telling me how they've done things, how it's always been done, how it's always been produced by their father and their grandfather and whatever else. When I sit with more dynamic families that are looking at what they're doing, they're talking about what they're producing to a market and an outcome. So they're making decisions about their business, about who wants to buy what it is that they're producing, not that they just want to breed it or they just want to grow it. Because the basic principle of marketing is you produce something that a market wants. What's a need versus what a market needs, not what they want. In the sense that we can produce the prettiest livestock in the world, but if no one wants to buy them from a commercial outcome, I'll be very happy. I just won't make much money. And you've got to create and you've got to be prepared to be understanding of what that market is doing. Whether you're producing stock that you sell at a weaner sale or whether you're producing feeder cattle or whatever that works to be, you have to be prepared to think about what you're doing and what that actually means in the sense of where that market's going to be for that product. The challenge is that's often not what people are doing. They're doing it for some other reason. And the challenge is that they've just crossed the line that they're doing something for an emotional lifestyle reason, not purely as a business. Because if you're purely doing it as a business, you'd produce what your market is going to value and sell and what you can deal with it. And it's very, very challenging to sit down and get people to understand at what point are you crossing the line here and is your business becoming your lifestyle? And I'm not saying that's a bad thing. I'm just saying you need to be aware of it and not comparing what you're doing or the profitability you're doing versus somebody else, because it's your right to do whatever the hell you like. If you want to simply breed stock or grow grass, sell hay, do whatever else it is, and that's your satisfaction, fantastic. But the real people that are moving and growing with this are the people that are adapting to make sure that they're aware what it is that they're producing there's a longer term market for, not having to produce it and then find someone to sell it to. They almost know where they're going to buy that or what that market's going to be because they're producing something of a consistent quality they know that market wants. And the greatest challenge, and I face this constantly, and my litmus test for many, many things is I go back to a couple of locations, one in Gloucester, one in Stroud, and there's people still sitting at the bars that I thought were old people when I was much younger, and they're still telling similar stories to what they were saying that I heard much younger, but they haven't moved. Now, that might mean success for them. What I'm seeing is that often they had assets that now they don't own. And the challenge with that is that they weren't willing to adapt because at some point in time it became this lifestyle. Now, if that's what you want, great. But if you want succession planning, you want growth, you want integration, you've got to be prepared to work out what part of this is business and what part of this is, that lifestyle experience. Now, hopefully, either one of them are pleasurable because you shouldn't be doing unless you enjoy it. But there is a conscious decision to be made here for people, particularly in family businesses, about which one of those two things has got a greater weighting in what you're doing. Because if it is about the business, then you need to be focused about where your product's going and who's paying for it, not what you're producing.
That's sage advice. I think there's a quote. I always love to butcher quotes, but it was something along the lines, it's not the fastest, it's not the smartest that's going to survive. It's the most adaptable to change. I think that might have been Charles Darwin from memory. I'll probably butcher this. Someone will tell me on the podcast. But yeah, I think that's great advice. So what we might do is we're getting sort of towards the end of this now. I know everyone's starting to get hungry. I can see Jeff sitting there. He's had a big day at the sale. Have we got some questions for the audience? Have we got anyone that would like to ask a question of Garry? I'm sure there'd be some.
Thank you for giving us your time and well done on everything you've achieved in agriculture. In regards to beef, lamb, chicken, do you see, and you touched on it in regards to proteins, a corporate need for dairy in a large scale?
Well, I think we need a family need and an investment in dairy because a lot of this stuff, and I grew up in areas where dairy farms were prevalent and the efficiency of it. The fundamental, and I mentioned this about what's going on with the protein globally, dairy is the first protein product that goes into these places. What's going on in Indonesia at the moment is that they're trying to get milk into that situation. I'm sure you all heard the stories about what happened many years ago in China when they put the substituted products and they unfortunately killed those children. Well, that was because they were trying to get dairy into the diet, because getting dairy in and what that does for bone growth and the proteins within it, dairy is an essential part of what is this mix as far as that's concerned. Yes, I'd like to see bigger investment. How that investment comes is I'm agnostic about. I just want to see good, efficient operators in whatever sector that they're involved in, and I want to see them be able to compete with a fair price. What I hated about the dairy is the manipulation that the supermarkets did in that process, because they used an essential need of a dairy product to sell other products to the pure detriment of the dairy producer. So that's a great example of not having an alternate market stream as far as that's concerned. If you look at what's happening in a lot of dairy processing these days, there's a lot of product that goes offshore. We're an exporting producer of dairy. In any of these markets, when you have a single situation, particularly if you have it singly to a big dominant supermarket that wants to use you as the stick to beat everything else up, that's a real problem. And the dairy industry got itself into a bad cycle. It was a race to the bottom because no one was prepared to say no to the supermarkets. And sometimes you have to. Sometimes no is the most powerful word you say in any of these situations. So I'm not going to do that. And it's important in all of these sectors that you don't devalue what it is that you're doing. And unfortunately, dairy has suffered around that. I hope we have a vibrant dairy industry for many generations to come.
We got anyone else? Any other questions?
Thanks, Ben. No, Garry, I was just wondering, will you or the company at all look to move into meat processing at all in the future?
We've actually been in meat processing because one of the early projects that we did, it was called Project Never, because one of the things we onboarded some people, I said, we'll do anything in agriculture as long as it's not meat processing. And that was the very next project we did. But how that unfolded was a situation where a supermarket was using its dominant power to manipulate its provider, which was a processing plant, at the end of its contract. And it was using the end of that contract as the terminal outcome to say, basically, you must sell your asset to us, or otherwise we're going to tear up the contract. That's very similar to the milk use. So looking at it, we saw the opportunity and said, well, this makes no sense. In this case, this business is a good business. We bought it. The actual supermarket in question, because this was a public unlisted company, called the shareholder meeting. They announced their bid. We had someone in the room that outbid them by 1 cent a share, and we walked out owning a Meatworks the next day. And one of the things about Meatworks is that everyone thinks they can run them until you do have to run them. And we thought we knew a fair bit about this until 7 days in, and we worked out that we knew nothing. And then it's a pretty steep learning curve. So processing is something that we have no intention of being a tease or a JBS or anyone involved in it, but being involved in processing as such doesn't concern us. But it's something that we would do most likely in a partnership. And it's how you got to understand that the meat processing industry in Australia is one of two of the last manufacturing industries, because the other one's the dairy industry. And we've lost a lot of the skill set around that. There are specialist people that physically deal with the efficiencies around that. Today we contract. So we custom contract a number of plants to process the product for us. But when you do those type of things, and it's a great idea, and I remember being involved in some producer groups that thought it was a great idea to have brands in this process, but what they didn't realise is all the other issues that come with it. You've got to have scale, you've got to have consistency, you've got to do it every week of the year, not just the weeks that your grass grows. And processing is a bit the same thing. You've got to be prepared to look longer term. And I guess, Ben, to some extent, this goes back to the questions about agriculture. You've got to look longer term than what is the monthly and quarterly outcome, because most of the investment's gone wrong in agriculture in the past because people have tried to look at like the share market. You've got to take a longer term view. And certainly if you're entering into processing, you need to take a longer term view, because there's times you'll make plenty of money. I guarantee you the lamb processors aren't making much money at the moment, but I suspect they'll pick up some on the other side of this. And, you've got to have specialists that go with you in those type of situations. So that's probably a longer answer than what you're after, but that's the context.
Fantastic. Well, and if anyone's urgently wants to ask, we do have one last. This might be the last one, because I reckon everyone will be getting hungry now, Jeff.
You've said a number of times tonight you started out with something you thought was a good idea and you've got involved in it and you discovered you knew nothing about it. How would you advise a young chap getting involved in agriculture these days?
On my way back, I'll just let you know before Garry jumps in, is I like to ask all of my guests what's the big piece of advice they give themselves if they could go back 20 years. And usually the number one statement is back yourself, just have a crack. It's surprising. So I'm interested to see what you've got to say, Garry.
Agriculture is a really interesting industry, a bit like people in this room, and I can point to people in this room that have done this for me personally, that are very positive investing and see others succeed. So as a young person, you need to back your ambition, but you need to be prepared to go and engage with people, ask them questions, accept the fact that you probably don't know all the answers as a young person getting involved in this stuff, and then take some balance from the experience that is here. There's so many opportunities about how people want to get involved in agriculture. If they want to go back and be a producer these days, depending on whether they're in a family situation or get involved in other companies or criteria around it, agriculture is so diverse as to the number of roles and opportunities that sit within it. But it starts off with the foundation of ask questions, because the moment you think you know every answer, it will bite you. And you've got to be prepared to take on and build a network of people that you can go and have some tough conversations with. And the challenge here is don't lose your enthusiasm, because the enthusiasm is what will drive you to be successful. But very few people are ever born with the concept of all the knowledge that they need to know. And it's got to be that willingness to go and engage and get involved in it in whatever capacity is. And, there's been hundreds or thousands of people that have helped me in different ways, from when I started as that young person leading a Hereford heifer around, to all of those experiences in judging livestock and all the things you learn to today. We don't ever stop learning. Occasionally we go through a phase where we stop asking questions. And I constantly keep saying to the young people in our business, ask questions, ask questions, ask questions. There's a reason why you got two ears and one mouth. Use them proportionately. And listen a whole lot more than what you talk. What happens a lot for young people is they get brought up in this era of social media, and where the instant opinion doesn't have to be accurate, but it's the opinion. When you're involved in your own business and your own career, at some point in time, you've got to be prepared to ask the questions about whether that's realistic. And unfortunately, our education system and the social media system doesn't always encourage young people to do that. And it's quite a challenge for them to open up and get involved in that situation. One final thing I'll say, because you asked this earlier, and you commented on this earlier, Ben, when we employ people in our business, I'm the worst person to interview them because I don't care what qualification they got. I employ them all on attitude. So when we sit down and we have an interview, ultimately all the HR department, they'll go and score them whichever way they want. I'll score them entirely on attitude, whether they've got the attitude to be engaged and part of a team, culturally fit, and whether they've got an aptitude to learn. Because ultimately, all I want to see when we're employing young people is that they completed something. I actually do not care what course they did or what it was, as long as they completed it, where they went and worked in a fruit picking job and they finished the contract. It's the attitude and the aptitude to get to the completion. Because the greatest human fault is the finishing fault. How many projects do people have in this room that they've started and not finished? The greatest skill in all of this stuff is the finishing trait, not the starting trait. So even when you start something, and it's hard, that doesn't mean you stop. It means you need to suck it up and think about it and work out how you're going to get to that finish line. And all too often today in society is that we give too many easy options out, that it's okay to start something and not be successful. Yeah, that's a learning. But ultimately, if you don't get to the habit of finishing and completing, then you're going to have a pretty poor outcome because it costs money to start things. You only make money when you finish them. And that's a pretty tough lesson for people to learn.
I love that. And it's funny, I always talk about, we have an acronym which is GWC when you're dealing with people, the next generation coming through. And number one is they've got to get it, G. Number two, they've got to want it. And number three, they've got to have the capacity. So the capacity to do the job, but also commit to following it through. So totally concur with that. So look, Garry, we're ready for dinner now. I know the staff out the back will be chomping at the bit. Everyone probably wants another drink. Thanks very much, Garry. That's been very, very insightful. I've learned a lot. I'm looking forward to going back and getting that episode edited and out there. So if everyone could just give us a hand for Garry. Great job, mate. Really enjoyed it.
Well, it's not every day you get to hear directly from someone managing over $1 billion in ag assets and still thinking about the same challenges and opportunities that many of you are facing on farm. A massive thanks to Garry Edwards for his time and his honesty, and to Jeff Birchnell and the entire 3R team for putting on another brilliant night and making the Fireside chat possible. Now, if this episode struck a chord, the best thank you we can get is for you to share it with someone else in the industry. I'm Ben Law, I'm the financial bloke, and remember, it's more important who you are than what you have. I'll see you next time.